My dad said he was preparing us for the real world. I had no idea his training would nearly kill us. The first survival drill happened on my 13th birthday. Dad woke me at midnight, handed me a backpack with 3 days of supplies, and drove me 2 hours into the Cascade Wilderness. He pointed at a trail marker barely visible in his headlights and told me to follow it north until I reached the logging road where he'd pick me up in 72 hours. No phone, no GPS, just a compass and a worn topographic map. My younger brother Ethan watched from the back seat, his face pressed against the window, his eyes wide with something between fear and excitement. Our older brother Liam sat stone-faced in the passenger seat, having completed this exact test 6 months earlier when he turned 13. Dad said this was how men learned self-reliance, that the real world wouldn't coddle us when things got hard, and he refused to raise sons who crumbled at the first sign of adversity. He drove away before I could ask questions, his taillights disappearing around a curve, leaving me alone in the absolute darkness of the forest with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant call of an owl. I made it back to the logging road in 60 hours, hungry and exhausted, but alive. Dad was waiting with the truck, a thermos of hot soup, and a smile that looked almost proud. He asked if I'd been scared, and I lied and said no because admitting fear felt like failing the test. He nodded and said good. That fear was just information, and real men processed information without letting it control them. Liam shook my hand when I climbed into the truck, a formal gesture that felt more like a military ritual than brotherly affection. Ethan hugged me hard and whispered that he was terrified for his own turn in 2 years. Mom had dinner waiting when we got home, a full spread of my favorite foods, but she wouldn't look at me directly. Her hands shook slightly as she served the mashed potatoes, and I noticed she'd been crying recently because her eyes were red and swollen. She'd stopped arguing with Dad about the drills months ago after a particularly brutal fight that ended with her locked in their bedroom for 2 days. Now she just cooked and cleaned and maintained the house like a hotel manager, present but disconnected from anything that mattered. Dad's survival philosophy started small and reasonable. Weekend camping trips where he taught us to build shelters and start fires without matches, fishing expeditions where we learned to clean and cook our catch, navigation exercises in local parks where we'd practice using maps and compasses. He'd explained that modern society had made people soft and dependent, that most men couldn't survive a week without electricity or grocery stores, and his sons would be different. He'd show us news articles about natural disasters and economic collapses, pointing out how unprepared people died while the prepared thrived. Mom, I would listen from the kitchen, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she never contradicted him in front of us. The training escalated gradually over the next few years, each new exercise slightly more intense than the last, the progression so smooth, we barely noticed how extreme it was becoming until we were already deep into it and couldn't remember what normal looked like anymore. By the time Ethan turned 13 and faced his wilderness trial, Dad had added new requirements. We had to complete quarterly survival challenges that grew increasingly difficult. Winter camping in sub-zero temperatures with minimal gear, multi-day hikes covering 50 miles with 40-pound packs, orienteering competitions where we'd race to find checkpoints scattered across miles of terrain, the last one to finish losing privileges like hot showers or cooked meals for a week. Dad documented everything in detailed spreadsheets, tracking our times and performance metrics like we were athletes in training. He'd review the data with us monthly, pointing out weaknesses and setting goals for improvement. Liam excelled at everything and became Dad's favorite, his name always at the top of the performance charts. I fell somewhere in the middle, competent but not exceptional. Ethan struggled with the physical demands, his smaller frame and asthmatic lungs making the challenges brutally hard. Dad showed no mercy for Ethan's disadvantages, saying the real world wouldn't care about our excuses, and neither would he. The training consumed our lives completely. Dad pulled us from public school when I was 15, claiming the education system was indoctrinating kids with weakness and dependency. He designed our homeschool curriculum himself, focusing on practical skills like mechanics, construction, first aid, and wilderness survival. Academic subjects were minimized to basic math and functional literacy. He said we didn't need to know about poetry or history or science beyond what helped us survive. Mom became our official teacher, following Dad's lesson plans without deviation, her voice flat and mechanical as she read from textbooks. We'd complete our academic work by noon, then spend the rest of the day on physical training, running miles with weighted vests, building structures from raw materials, practicing medical skills on mannequins Dad bought from a surplus store, learning to shoot and maintain firearms with precision. Every evening, Dad would quiz us on survival scenarios, describing emergencies and demanding immediate solutions. Wrong answers meant additional training the next day. The isolation was deliberate and systematic. Dad said outside influences would contaminate our training and fill our heads with soft ideologies about feelings and fairness. We had no internet access, no television, no contact with former friends or extended family. Our maternal grandparents stopped visiting after Dad told them their presence was disruptive to our development. Mom's sister called a few times trying to check on us, but Dad screened all calls and eventually changed our number. The only people we saw were Dad's survival group friends, men who shared his philosophy and sometimes joined our training exercises. They'd praise Dad's dedication and tell us we were lucky to have a father who cared enough to prepare us properly. One of them, a man named Gerald Vance, who ran a prepper supply store, started providing Dad with increasingly extreme training materials. Military manuals on interrogation resistance, guides for surviving chemical attacks, instructions for building improvised weapons. Gerald would visit monthly, drinking beer with Dad in the garage while discussing worst-case scenarios and societal collapse like it was inevitable and imminent. The first major injury happened during a winter survival challenge when I was 16. Dad dropped the three of us in the mountains during a snowstorm with instructions to build a shelter and survive 3 nights. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees the first night. Ethan's shelter collapsed under heavy snow around 2 in the morning, and he spent hours exposed before managing to dig himself out and join Liam and me in our shelter. By morning, his lips were blue, and he couldn't stop shaking. Liam wanted to activate the emergency beacon Dad had given us for life-threatening situations, but I knew Dad would see it as failure. We kept Ethan warm between us, forcing him to drink water we'd melted from snow, and somehow got him through until Dad's pickup time. Dad took one look at Ethan's mild frostbite and the blackened tips of 2 fingers and said it was a valuable lesson about shelter construction. He didn't take him to a doctor. He treated the frostbite himself with supplies from his extensive medical kit, and Ethan lost sensation in those fingertips permanently. Mom cried quietly in the bathroom that night, but when I tried to talk to her about it, she just said Dad knew what he was doing, and we had to trust his judgment. Dad introduced scenario training when Liam turned 18, exercises designed to simulate real-world emergencies. He'd create situations without warning and force us to respond immediately. Once, he cut the power to the house at 3 in the morning and filled the first floor with smoke from a smoke machine, shouting that there was a fire and we had 60 seconds to evacuate. Another time, he staged a home invasion scenario where Gerald and 2 other men from the survival group broke in wearing masks, and we had to defend the house using the training Dad had drilled into us. The scenarios were terrifyingly realistic. During the home invasion drill, I actually hit Gerald with a baseball bat before realizing it was an exercise. He wore protective padding, but the impact was hard enough to knock him down. Dad congratulated me for my aggressive response and said hesitation in real emergencies got people killed. Gerald laughed it off and said I had good instincts. Nobody mentioned that these drills were traumatizing or that living in constant readiness for disaster was destroying our ability to feel safe anywhere. Mom started showing signs of complete breakdown around this time. She'd forget to cook meals or would make the same dish multiple days in a row. Her hair went unwashed for weeks. She'd have full conversations with us and then have no memory of them later. Once, I found her standing in the backyard at midnight in her nightgown, staring at nothing. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was trying to remember what she used to want from life, before it all became about Dad's plans. I brought her inside and made her tea, and she held the cup without drinking, tears sliding down her face silently. I asked if she wanted to leave, and her eyes widened with something like terror. She said we couldn't leave because Dad would find us, and the consequences would be worse than staying. I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later. The next morning, she was back to her mechanical routine like the conversation never happened, and I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. The drowning drill shattered whatever remained of my belief that Dad's methods were reasonable. It happened on a June morning when I was 17. Dad drove us to a remote lake, produced 3 weighted vests, and explained we were doing aquatic survival training. He had us put on the vests, each adding 30 pounds of weight, and wade into the water until we were chest deep. Then he explained the exercise. We'd swim to a marker 300 yards offshore, and the last person to reach it would do the drill again with an additional 10 pounds. The vests were buoyant enough that we wouldn't sink immediately, but heavy enough that swimming was exhausting. Liam reached the marker first, powerful and efficient in the water. I made it second, my arms burning and my lungs screaming. Ethan struggled badly, his asthmatic breathing becoming labored within the first 100 yards. I watched him fall further behind, his head barely above water, his strokes becoming uncoordinated and desperate. He was drowning. I screamed for Dad, who was watching from the shore with binoculars. He shouted back that Ethan needed to finish the drill or he'd do it again tomorrow with more weight. I swam back to Ethan without thinking, grabbed him, and helped him to the marker. Dad was furious when we reached shore. He said I'd robbed Ethan of the chance to overcome his weakness independently and proven I didn't understand how real growth worked. The punishment was that both Ethan and I would repeat the drill the next day with 40 pounds each. That night, I tried to talk to Liam about what had happened, about how Dad had been willing to watch Ethan drown rather than intervene. Liam's response chilled me more than anything Dad had done. He said Ethan needed to learn his limits, and Dad was right that helping him was actually hurting him long term. He said the real world wouldn't send rescue, so we shouldn't either. His eyes were flat and emotionless when he said it, and I realized my older brother had been completely reprogrammed by Dad's philosophy. He'd internalized the cruelty and reframed it as wisdom. When I suggested maybe Dad was taking things too far, Liam reported the conversation to Dad immediately. Dad called a family meeting that evening and gave a 2-hour lecture about loyalty and unity, and how questioning the program showed weak character. He made me apologize to Liam for trying to undermine our family's values. Mom sat silently throughout, picking at her cuticles until they bled, her face completely blank. The next phase of training focused on what Dad called psychological resilience. He began subjecting us to stress scenarios designed to break our emotional responses. He'd deprive us of sleep for days, while forcing us to complete complex tasks, punishing errors with additional hours of wakefulness. He'd blast loud noises and strobe lights at random times to keep us in a constant state of hypervigilance. He'd give us impossible problems with no correct solutions, and then berate us for failing to solve them. The goal, he explained, was to teach us that emotions were liabilities, and clear thinking required suppressing feelings entirely. Liam adapted by becoming robotic, his affect completely flat regardless of circumstances. I tried to maintain some connection to my emotions while hiding them from Dad, but the constant suppression was exhausting. Ethan had panic attacks during the worst sessions, hyperventilating and crying, which Dad treated as opportunities for more intensive training rather than signs of harm. He'd force Ethan to continue whatever task triggered the panic until he could complete it without visible distress, sessions that sometimes lasted 12 hours. Gerald Vance's involvement deepened as my 18th birthday approached. He and Dad spent increasing amounts of time together, planning what they called the ultimate survival challenge. I'd overhear fragments of their conversations through the garage door, words like total immersion and real consequences and breakthrough training. Gerald would laugh and say Dad was going to produce the most capable young men in the country. Dad would respond that capability meant nothing without proving it under genuine pressure. They were planning something extreme, and the secrecy around it made my stomach churn with dread. I tried to warn Mom, but she'd retreated so far into herself that meaningful conversation was impossible. She'd nod and say everything would be fine, and Dad always knew best, her voice empty of conviction. Once, I found anxiety medication hidden in her bathroom drawer, prescribed months earlier, but the bottle still full. She wasn't even trying to cope anymore, just enduring each day until it ended. The ultimate challenge was revealed 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. Dad and Gerald drove the three of us 6 hours to a remote property Gerald owned in the high desert, a desolate area of sagebrush and rocky canyons miles from the nearest town. They explained the exercise with disturbing enthusiasm. We'd be dropped in the wilderness with no supplies except the clothes we wore and one knife to share between us. We had to survive for 30 days, finding our own food and water, building our own shelter, and making our own way back to civilization. The property bordered public land, so we could travel freely, but Dad and Gerald would be monitoring us remotely using trail cameras they'd installed. If we asked for rescue or gave up before the 30 days, we'd be judged as failures, and the consequences would be severe. Dad didn't specify what those consequences were, and his vague threat was somehow more frightening than explicit punishment. Gerald handed us a topographic map showing the property boundaries and the general direction of the nearest highway, approximately 40 miles away. Then they drove off in a cloud of dust, leaving us standing in the brutal afternoon sun with nothing but our fear and each other. The first 3 days were manageable because we still had energy reserves. We found a seasonal creek providing minimal water and built a basic shelter from sagebrush and rocks. We caught and ate insects, lizards, and one small snake that Liam killed with a rock. But by day 4, the reality of our situation became clear. This wasn't a training exercise. It was a death march. The desert temperature exceeded 100 degrees during the day and dropped into the 40s at night. Water was scarce, and we had no way to purify it except boiling, which required starting fires without matches, using hand-drill friction methods that took hours. We were burning calories faster than we could replace them. Ethan's asthma was triggered by the dust and smoke, and without his inhaler, he struggled to breathe properly. By day 7, we were all significantly weaker. My joints ached constantly. Liam developed painful mouth sores from malnutrition. Ethan could barely walk more than a few hundred yards without resting. We were dying slowly, and the trail cameras recording our suffering offered no help. I decided on day 9 that we needed to abandon the challenge and hike toward the highway. Liam disagreed violently, saying we couldn't fail Dad's test because failure would mean we'd wasted years of training. We argued for hours, our voices hoarse from dehydration, until Ethan quietly said he didn't think he could survive 3 more weeks. That settled it for me. I told Liam he could stay if he wanted, but Ethan and I were leaving. Liam reluctantly agreed to come with us, but his resentment was palpable. We started walking at dawn, following the map toward where the highway should be. The terrain was brutal, endless rocky hills and steep canyons that forced us to detour miles out of our way. We traveled maybe 6 miles that first day. Ethan collapsed twice, his breathing ragged and shallow. That night, huddled under an overhanging rock, I realized we might not make it to the highway. We were too weak, too dehydrated, too malnourished. The 40-mile journey could take us 2 weeks at our current pace, and we didn't have 2 weeks left in us. On day 11, we found a dead deer that looked relatively fresh. Liam insisted we butcher it and cook the meat despite the risks of eating carrion. We were desperate enough to try. Using our single knife, we carved strips of meat from the carcass and built a fire to cook it. The meat tasted rank and made us all violently sick within hours. We spent the next 2 days too weak to move, vomiting and suffering diarrhea that further dehydrated us. I became delirious with fever, hallucinating conversations with Mom where she apologized for not protecting us. Ethan's breathing became so labored that I thought he was dying. each breath a wet rattle that sounded like drowning. Liam recovered fastest and tried to care for both of us, forcing us to drink water and keeping the fire going through the nights when our fevers spiked. I have fragmented memories of those days, moments of clarity surrounded by confusion and pain. At some point, I decided that if I died out here, at least I'd tried to save my brothers. That felt like a more honorable ending than succeeding at Dad's monstrous test. We were rescued on day 14 by a Bureau of Land Management ranger named Thomas Shepard, who was doing a routine patrol and spotted our smoke. He found 3 severely dehydrated, malnourished, and sick teenage boys barely conscious around a dying fire. He radioed for emergency medical evacuation immediately, then started providing first aid while we waited for the helicopter. I remember him asking what happened, and I tried to explain about Dad's training challenge, but the words came out confused and incomplete. He looked horrified and kept saying we were going to be okay now, that he had us, that we were safe. The helicopter arrived within 40 minutes, a bright yellow medical chopper that landed 50 yards from our camp. Paramedics rushed over with IV bags and equipment, checking our vitals and loading us onto stretchers. The last thing I saw before they loaded me into the helicopter was our pathetic shelter and the remains of the deer carcass, evidence of how close we'd come to dying for Dad's idea of preparation. We were transported to a regional hospital where doctors treated us for severe dehydration, malnutrition, heat exhaustion, and food poisoning. Ethan was placed in intensive care because his respiratory system was compromised and he'd developed pneumonia. Liam and I were in slightly better condition, but still critically weak. A doctor named Fatima Rashid examined me thoroughly, noting my low body weight, depleted electrolytes, and signs of prolonged stress. She asked careful questions about how we ended up in the desert in that condition. I was too exhausted to lie convincingly, and the truth spilled out in fragments. She listened with increasing alarm, making notes and occasionally excusing herself to make phone calls. Later that evening, a woman from Child Protective Services named Nicole Brennan arrived to interview me. She was in her 30s with kind eyes and a calm voice that made me feel like maybe she could actually help. She asked me to describe our living situation, and once I started talking, I couldn't stop. Everything emerged. The escalating drills, the isolation, the injuries, Mom's breakdown, the drowning incident, the 30-day challenge that nearly killed us. Nicole contacted law enforcement immediately. 2 detectives, Raymond Cross and Jennifer Wu, arrived the next morning to interview all 3 of us separately. I told them everything, showing them scars from previous injuries and describing Dad's systematic training program in detail. Liam refused to cooperate, insisting Dad hadn't done anything wrong and we'd just gotten unlucky with the deer meat. He maintained Dad was preparing us for inevitable societal collapse and his methods were necessary. The detectives looked disturbed but pressed forward with questions about specific incidents. Detective Cross focused on the drowning drill while Detective Wu asked about the forced isolation and homeschooling. They recorded everything and said they'd be investigating further. After they left, Liam accused me of betraying the family and destroying everything Dad built. He said I was weak, exactly what Dad had tried to train out of us, and he hoped I was proud of myself for ruining our family. His words hurt more than any of Dad's physical training because they came from my brother, and they proved how thoroughly Dad had poisoned his mind. Dad and Mom were arrested 3 days later at our house. Police executed a search warrant and found extensive documentation of Dad's training program, including videos of various drills, detailed performance logs, and written plans for escalating challenges. They also found communications between Dad and Gerald Vance, discussing the 30-day challenge and their awareness of its dangers. Both men were arrested and charged with multiple counts of child endangerment, abuse, and reckless endangerment. Mom was charged with child neglect and failure to protect. I felt sick watching the arrest footage on the hospital television, seeing Dad handcuffed and loaded into a police car while maintaining his self-righteous expression, certain he'd done nothing wrong. Mom looked broken, her face empty and her body limp, as officers guided her to a separate vehicle. Neighbors who'd rarely seen us over the years told reporters they'd thought we moved away. They had no idea we were still living there under those conditions. The isolation had been so complete that our suffering was invisible to the outside world. Ethan was released from the hospital after 9 days, his pneumonia responding to antibiotics and his breathing gradually improving. Liam and I were released after 6 days, both of us weak but recovering. Child Protective Services placed us in emergency foster care while the legal proceedings moved forward. We were sent to separate homes temporarily because finding placement for 3 traumatized teenage boys together was impossible on short notice. I ended up with a family named the Colemans, a middle-aged couple with no other foster children who seemed completely overwhelmed by my situation. They were kind, but had no framework for understanding what I'd been through. They tried to feed me normally, but my stomach couldn't handle regular portions after months of restricted eating. They encouraged me to sleep, but I'd been conditioned to wake at the slightest sound and couldn't stay asleep more than a few hours. Everything about normal life felt alien and threatening. I'd spent years learning that comfort was weakness and safety was an illusion, and I couldn't just switch that programming off because I was rescued. The preliminary hearing happened 4 weeks after our rescue. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lillian Foster, presented overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse and endangerment. Medical reports detailed our injuries and malnutrition. Ranger Shepard testified about finding us near death in the desert. Detective Cross described the training program as documented in materials seized from the house. Dad's attorney, a smug man named Philip Granger, argued that Dad had parental rights to educate and train his children as he saw fit, that everything was done with good intentions, and that the real crime was government overreach into family autonomy. He portrayed Dad as a concerned father preparing his sons for uncertain times, not an abuser. The judge, a woman named Harriet Voss, listened to both arguments with a stern expression. She ruled that the evidence demonstrated clear and present danger to minors and ordered Dad, Mom, and Gerald held pending trial. She also ordered psychological evaluations for all three of us boys to assess the extent of trauma and determine appropriate interventions. My psychological evaluation was conducted by a trauma specialist named Dr. Marcus Fields, who spent hours interviewing me about our experiences. He administered various assessment tools measuring PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, and attachment issues. The results showed severe trauma markers across every category. He diagnosed me with complex PTSD, major depression, and hypervigilance patterns consistent with prolonged abuse. He explained that Dad's training had essentially reprogrammed my nervous system to operate in constant survival mode, that my brain had been shaped by chronic stress into perceiving threats everywhere. He said recovery would require intensive therapy to help me learn that safety was real and the world wasn't the constant danger zone Dad had taught me it was. He recommended long-term placement in a therapeutic foster home with parents trained in trauma-informed care. Ethan's evaluation showed similar results, plus severe anxiety specific to his near-death experiences. Liam's evaluation was more disturbing. He showed signs of identification with his abuser and rejection of reality regarding the harm done to him. Dr. Fields recommended residential treatment for Liam to address what he termed cult-like indoctrination. The trial began 8 months after our rescue. The courtroom was packed with journalists and advocates, our case having gained significant media attention as an extreme example of survivalist parenting gone wrong. The prosecution called witness after witness. Medical experts testified about our injuries and malnutrition. Dr. Fields explained the psychological damage Dad inflicted. Ranger Shepard described our condition when found. Detective Wu presented evidence from Dad's own documentation showing he planned and executed increasingly dangerous training despite knowing the risks. The defense strategy focused on parental rights and claimed Dad's methods, while unconventional, were protected under constitutional freedoms. They called expert witnesses who testified about the importance of resilience training and self-sufficiency skills. They tried to paint us as willing participants who benefited from challenging experiences. Liam actually testified for the defense, stating that Dad's training made him strong and capable, that he wasn't abused but educated in survival skills most people lacked. His testimony was devastating to watch because it revealed how thoroughly Dad had colonized his thinking. I testified on day 6 of the trial. Lillian Foster asked me to describe specific incidents in chronological order, letting the cumulative effect build naturally. I talked about my first wilderness trial at 13, the escalating challenges over the years, Ethan's near drowning, the psychological torture of the stress scenarios, and finally the 30-day challenge that nearly killed us. I described watching my brother struggle to breathe while Dad refused to help, eating carrion out of desperation, and thinking I was going to die in the desert because Dad valued proving a point over our lives. I maintained composure until Lillian asked what I wanted people to understand about what happened to us. That's when I broke down completely, crying in the witness box while trying to explain that we were just kids who trusted our father to protect us, and instead he used that trust to hurt us systematically for years. The courtroom was silent, except for my crying. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. Dad sat emotionless at the defense table, his face showing no reaction to my testimony. The defense cross-examination was brutal. Philip Granger tried to make me admit that I learned valuable skills from Dad's training, that I was stronger and more capable because of it. He asked if I could survive in the wilderness now, and I said yes, but that didn't make what Dad did okay. He suggested I was exaggerating the danger of the 30-day challenge, pointing out that we survived it. I told him we survived despite Dad's plan, not because of it, and if Ranger Shepard hadn't found us, we'd be dead. Granger pressed harder, asking if I was angry at Dad for pushing me beyond my comfort zone, suggesting my testimony was revenge for being held to high standards. I looked directly at Dad for the first time since taking the stand and said no. I was angry at him for valuing his ideological experiment more than his children's lives, for turning our childhood into a trauma laboratory, and for breaking Mom's mind and Liam's soul in service of his delusional survivalist fantasies. The judge sustained an objection about the characterization, but the jury had heard it. Granger had no more questions. Gerald Vance's trial was separate but concurrent. His charges focused on his role in planning and facilitating the 30-day challenge. The prosecution presented communications showing Gerald knew the challenge was potentially lethal and encouraged Dad to proceed anyway. They also revealed Gerald had a financial motive. He'd been secretly filming our training for years, planning to produce a documentary series about extreme preparedness parenting that he believed would attract significant media rights payments. He'd installed multiple hidden cameras on his property to capture our suffering during the 30-day challenge, intending to use the footage as the series finale. The discovery of this exploitation added new charges for unauthorized recording of minors and attempted commercial exploitation. Gerald's defense argued he believed the training was legitimate and had no duty to interfere with a parent's choices. The jury found him guilty on all counts after 3 hours of deliberation. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, though he'd ultimately serve less with good behavior. Mom's trial was complicated by her obvious mental deterioration. Her attorney presented evidence that she'd been psychologically abused by Dad for years, that she'd developed learned helplessness and believed resistance was impossible. Multiple experts testified about battered woman syndrome and how extended abuse destroys the ability to protect others. Mom herself testified briefly, speaking in a flat monotone about how Dad slowly isolated her from family and convinced her his way was the only way, how she'd watched herself fail her children in real time but felt powerless to stop it. She cried while apologizing to us, saying she knew sorry wasn't enough, but it was all she had left. The prosecution acknowledged her victimhood, but maintained she had legal duty to protect us, that she violated repeatedly over years. The jury struggled with her case, deliberating for 2 days before returning a verdict. Guilty on neglect charges, but not guilty on failure to protect, effectively finding she was too damaged to fulfill her protective duty. The judge sentenced her to 5 years with credit for time served and mandated mental health treatment. She'd serve 3 years and be released on supervised probation. Dad's verdict came last. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 3 counts of aggravated child abuse, 3 counts of child endangerment, 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and 1 count of reckless endangerment. The evidence had been overwhelming, and his complete lack of remorse throughout the trial had sealed his fate. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later to allow for victim impact statements. In that waiting period, I struggled with what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to make him understand the damage he'd inflicted. Part of me wanted to ask why, to understand how a father could systematically traumatize his children while believing he was helping them. Mostly, I wanted him to acknowledge what he'd done, to show some recognition that his actions were wrong. Dr. Fields helped me write a statement that focused on impact rather than anger, documenting the ongoing effects of Dad's abuse on my daily life and functioning. The sentencing hearing was my last time seeing Dad in person. The courtroom felt smaller and more intimate than during the trial. Judge Voss invited victim impact statements. Ethan went first, his voice shaking as he read from prepared notes about his panic attacks, his ruined lungs, and his nightmares about drowning and dying of thirst. He said he'd never feel truly safe again because Dad taught him safety was an illusion and danger was everywhere. He said he loved Dad, but hated what Dad had done to us, and he didn't know how to reconcile those feelings. I went next, reading my statement about hypervigilance, about inability to trust others, about feeling defective for wanting comfort and connection instead of constant challenge. I told Dad directly that his training didn't prepare us for the real world. It damaged us so severely that navigating the real world became infinitely harder. I said his legacy wasn't strong sons, but broken boys who'd spend years learning to be human again. Liam refused to give a statement, remaining loyal to Dad even now. Judge Voss took 30 minutes to deliver her sentencing remarks. She reviewed the evidence systematically, describing Dad's actions as calculated, escalating, and sadistic, regardless of his stated intentions. She noted that he'd shown no remorse, no insight into his actions, and no indication he wouldn't repeat the behavior given the opportunity. She said parental rights were not unlimited, and Dad had violated the fundamental duty to protect his children in the most egregious ways possible. She sentenced him to 45 years in prison, noting that while he'd likely die there, she hoped the sentence sent a clear message that child abuse wouldn't be tolerated, regardless of ideological justification. Dad stood emotionless as she spoke, his face blank, and I realized he still didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. He'd go to his grave convinced he was right, and society was wrong, a martyr to his survivalist ideology. The bailiff led him away in handcuffs, and he never looked at any of us. That absence of acknowledgement hurt worse than any punishment. Nicole Brennan worked tirelessly to find appropriate long-term placements for all 3 of us. After months of searching, she located a therapeutic foster family willing to take Ethan and me together. Richard and Susan Yamamoto were experienced foster parents, specializing in trauma cases, with a large home and the training to handle our complex needs. Liam was placed separately in a residential treatment facility called New Horizons that specialized in cult deprogramming and ideological abuse recovery. The separation was necessary because Liam's presence triggered both Ethan and me, his continued defense of Dad making healing impossible. The Yamamotos welcomed us with remarkable patience. They established clear boundaries and routines, but allowed flexibility when we struggled. They never pushed us to talk about our experiences, but made themselves available when we needed to. They understood hypervigilance and didn't take it personally when we flinched at sudden movements or struggled to accept comfort. Adjusting to normal life was harder than surviving Dad's challenges. Everything felt wrong and threatening. Regular meals seemed excessive and made me feel guilty for consuming more than minimal rations. Comfortable beds felt unsafe because I'd been conditioned to sleep alert and ready for emergency. School seemed pointless when my education had focused exclusively on survival skills. The Yamamotos connected me with a trauma therapist named Dr. Samantha Ortiz, who specialized in abuse recovery. She used EMDR therapy to help process traumatic memories, gradually reducing their emotional intensity. She taught me grounding techniques for managing hypervigilance and anxiety. She helped me understand that my trauma responses were normal reactions to abnormal experiences, that I wasn't broken but injured, and injuries could heal with proper treatment. Progress was slow and non-linear. I'd have good weeks followed by terrible days when triggers would send me spiraling back into survival mode. Ethan's recovery followed a different path. His physical health improved with proper medical care, and his asthma became manageable with medication and clean air. But his anxiety remained severe, manifesting in panic attacks and phobic responses to situations reminiscent of our ordeals. He couldn't be in confined spaces without panicking, remembering the collapsed shelter and feeling buried alive. He couldn't be in water deeper than his knees without hyperventilating, the drowning drill having traumatized him permanently. He worked with Dr. Ortiz on exposure therapy, gradually building tolerance for his triggers. The Yamamotos supported him through every setback, never showing frustration with his struggles. Susan started a routine of checking on him hourly during the first few months, quietly opening his door and confirming he was okay. The consistent reassurance slowly helped him believe he was actually safe now, that no one was going to lock him in darkness or leave him to drown. Liam's treatment at New Horizons was intensive and prolonged. The facility used a combination of individual therapy, group sessions with other cult survivors, and educational programming about manipulation and thought control. His therapist, Dr. Julian Reeves, specialized in undoing ideological indoctrination. Progress reports Nicole shared with us indicated Liam was slowly beginning to recognize that Dad's worldview wasn't reality, but a distorted belief system designed to justify abuse. He started acknowledging that some of Dad's training had been harmful, though he struggled to fully accept the extent of damage. 6 months into treatment, he wrote us letters apologizing for his testimony at trial and for not protecting us when he should have. He said he was working on deprogramming Dad's voice from his head, but it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, because Dad's ideology had been his entire identity. The letters made me cry, because they showed my real brother was still in there, buried under years of indoctrination, but fighting to emerge. 2 years after our rescue, I testified before a state legislative committee reviewing homeschool regulations. Advocacy groups had used our case to push for mandatory oversight and periodic welfare checks for homeschooled children. I sat at a table facing legislators and explained how Dad's ability to isolate us completely had enabled years of escalating abuse with no outside intervention. I described how homeschooling could be wonderful, but also could be weaponized by abusive parents to hide their actions from scrutiny. I advocated for requiring regular assessments by qualified professionals and mandating minimum educational standards. Some legislators worried about government overreach and parental rights. I responded that parental rights ended where child safety began, and reasonable oversight wasn't persecution, but protection. The committee passed the legislation with minor amendments. The law required annual in-person assessments for all homeschooled children, standardized testing to ensure educational adequacy, and mandatory reporting training for assessment professionals. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress toward preventing what happened to us from happening to others. Mom was released from prison after serving 3 years. She moved to a halfway house in a different state and started intensive trauma therapy of her own. She wrote us letters monthly, updating us on her treatment progress and repeatedly apologizing for failing us. She never asked to visit or pushed for contact, respecting that we needed space to heal without her presence, complicating things. Her letters showed gradual improvement in her mental health and growing recognition of her culpability. She wrote once about finally understanding she'd had choices she didn't take, that being abused didn't absolve her of responsibility for enabling Dad's abuse of us. She said she'd spend the rest of her life trying to become someone worthy of our forgiveness, even if we never granted it. I didn't respond to her letters for the first year. Eventually, I wrote back briefly, acknowledging receipt and updating her on Ethan's and my progress. The correspondence remained distant and superficial, neither reconciliation nor rejection, but something undefined between. 3 years post-rescue, Liam was released from residential treatment and transitioned to a regular therapeutic foster home. Nicole arranged a family session with all 3 of us and our respective therapists present. Liam looked different, healthier, and somehow younger, like the years of rigid intensity had finally relaxed. He apologized again for his trial testimony and for not recognizing the abuse when it was happening. He said he'd been brainwashed so thoroughly that Dad's cruelty seemed like love and our suffering seemed like growth. He said he was working every day to rebuild his moral framework and learn to trust his own judgment again. Ethan forgave him immediately, desperate to have his older brother back. I struggled more with forgiveness, the wounds still too fresh, but I told him I was glad he was getting better, and maybe someday we could rebuild what Dad had destroyed between us. Dr. Ortiz said that was honest and appropriate, that forced forgiveness helped no one. Liam accepted my hesitation with grace and said he'd earn back my trust through consistent actions, not words. 4 years after our rescue, I graduated high school through a combination of online classes and therapeutic school programs. The Yamamotos threw a small celebration that felt surreal because normal family milestones had been absent from my life for so long. I'd been accepted to a local community college to study emergency management, finding that I could repurpose my survival skills toward legitimate disaster preparedness and response careers. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's training, meant to prepare us for societal collapse, had actually equipped me for a career helping communities survive real emergencies. Dr. Ortiz said that reclaiming the skills for healthy purposes was a powerful act of recovery, taking what was used to harm me and transforming it into something beneficial. Ethan graduated a year later and enrolled in art therapy training, wanting to help other traumatized kids express and process their experiences. Liam earned his GED from the treatment facility and began apprenticing as an electrician, finding satisfaction in building and repairing systems rather than preparing for their collapse. 5 years post-rescue, we had our first unsupervised visit as brothers, meeting at a neutral restaurant chosen by Nicole, who still monitored our case. We sat awkwardly at first, unsure how to relate without therapists mediating. Gradually, conversation flowed as we discovered we could talk about normal things like movies and work, and everyday frustrations without triggering each other. We could laugh about stupid jokes without someone analyzing whether our laughter was genuine or performative. We could disagree about minor things without it escalating into ideological warfare. Toward the end of the meal, Liam said he'd visited Dad in prison once just to see if he'd changed at all. He said Dad remained completely unrepentant, still convinced his methods were correct, and our suffering was necessary education. Liam said he'd told Dad he forgave him, but never wanted to see him again. That forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, and Dad would die alone with his ideology. That visit gave Liam closure, and hearing about it gave me permission to not need closure myself. Some wounds didn't heal through confrontation, but through acceptance that the person who hurt you would never provide what you needed from them. 8 years after Ranger Shepard found us dying in the desert, I'm completing my bachelor's degree in emergency management and working part-time with search and rescue teams. Ethan's thriving in his art therapy practice, helping traumatized children process their experiences through creative expression. Liam runs a small electrical contracting business and volunteers teaching job skills to at-risk youth. We gather monthly for dinner, maintaining connection while respecting each other's separate lives and ongoing healing. We're not the brothers Dad tried to create, hardened and emotionless, and prepared only for disaster. We're something better, men who survived horror, rebuilt ourselves from fragments, and chose connection over isolation. Mom reached out last year asking if we'd be willing to meet face-to-face. We're not ready yet, maybe never will be, but we've stopped actively hating her. The Yamamotos remain constant presences in our lives, the parents we needed when ours failed catastrophically. Richard taught me to see strength in vulnerability, that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. Susan taught Ethan that safety could be real and consistent, not illusory. Together, they showed all three of us that family was defined by care and protection, not shared genetics or forced loyalty. We still carry scars from Dad's training, literal and psychological marks that won't ever completely fade. But we also carry proof that we're stronger than what was done to us, that survival isn't just enduring abuse, but building meaningful lives afterward. Dad wanted to prepare us for the real world by making us hard and isolated and suspicious. Instead, he taught us the real world requires community, vulnerability, and the courage to trust despite being betrayed. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.